Greetings, everyone. I am thrilled to be back in conversation with my friend Melanie Reinhart, who needs no introduction, but um, she is an internationally known astrologer and author, and she's written Chiron and the Healing Journey, Saturn, Chiron and the Centaurs, and Incarnation, and is a leading expert in the exploration of the centaurs. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today and talking about their healing energy and what they are bringing to us in this critical time of transition and transformation on the planet. So thank you for being here, Melanie.
Thank you, Heather. I'm sort of grinning wildly because I so enjoy the conversations that we've had. And we've already been talking a little bit before the recording went on. And that was quite lovely. So thanks.
Yes, so we have many more conversations to allow to unfold. So,
Yes.
but let's talk today because, I mean, you have done so much profound work on Chiron, but you also have really helped elucidate some of the deeper meaning of Nisus, Pholus, and Chariklo. And I'd love to get into some of their different healing qualities that they bring in this time.
Mm-hmm.
But share some
Sure.
about your sense of them as you're deepening in your journey with them.
Well, I'm not what I would ever call a researcher. So in other words, I don't study the centaurs just because they're there and I'm curious. Maybe it's because I've got Mercury retrograde in the 8th house, right? That I can't work that way. I have to feel some kind of direct personal connection with the energy. And then I'm willing to put the effort in to do the research and all of that. But I can't just do it because it needs to be researched and so on. And so therefore, there's only 4 centaurs that I do work with routinely. And that's Chiron and his wife Chariklo, and then Pholus and Nessus. I have looked into a few of the others, but they haven't become an abiding interest with me. Chiron, Pholus, and Nessus are the only ones that really have a well-developed story in the classics, and a kind of almost an actual characterology about them, and the rest don't. The rest are maybe characterized by a small anecdote that connects them with one hero or one of the other gods and so forth. But they just don't have the amount of depth unless you happen to come across a chart or the story of a client where it tallies exactly with the anecdote that they're referred to in the classics. So that's my kind of haphazard criteria for what I study and what I don't study. But certainly those 4, I feel, have really accompanied my own astrological journey and indeed my life journey in a very big way. And so Chiron was discovered first in 1977, and initially they didn't know what to call Chiron, because an object that behaves like Chiron behaves was unknown in the whole solar system at that point. Chiron was first just referred to as a planetoid, meaning planet-like object. And then it was called an asteroid, and then called a comet. And then eventually a whole new subcategory of minor planets was given the designation of Centaurs. So, I mean, it's such a wonderful story there, because Chiron began as an exile who nobody understood. Nobody knew what he was, who he was, and so forth. And after 1992, when the Kuiper Belt was discovered, they began finding a whole lot more objects that had the same behavior characteristics as Chiron. And so hence, Chiron started out completely solo as an oddball or an exile, all of which are relevant to his themes, but ended up safely back within his whole tribe, I just loved that as a metaphor. And
it so fits with how Chiron's orbit is between the orbits of Saturn and Uranus, that how we fit into society, how we're trying to find our own independence and individuation and freedom, and that sense of differentness, and how we each can experience some of those wounds within ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, another detail which I love is that in Chiron's own history, astronomically, he has all these different appellations, and even to the point of being given a number. So he's got an asteroid number and a comet number, and those were all kept. So it wasn't like he was first called a planetoid and then called an asteroid, and so that was all rejected and swept away in favor of the new. Here, think Saturn, Uranus. Saturn being what's already been established, or the old ways, and so forth. And Uranus being an expression of the quantum leap into the new, into the future, into the forthcoming or the incoming. But crucially, with Chiron, he's right in between them. And so it's not that there's a line, a straight line, that tells us we must evolve from the old to the new. That's a nice idea, but it's not realistic as to how things happen. What's more realistic and more whole, in a way, is to find ways of incorporating what has been. So you don't have to destroy it necessarily, but there may be elements of it that really do seek to enter the future themselves. So this edge between Saturn and Uranus yields lots and lots of rich symbolism that we can all relate to. Now, remember that the sign of Aquarius, where Pluto is at the moment, and who, as of November the 20th this year, will take up residence in the sign of Aquarius until, is it 2044? I think that's right. Anyway, a long time. Pluto has one more little dip into Capricorn to go. And then the rulership of Aquarius will be very important in understanding what's going on with the transit of Pluto through Aquarius. And lo and behold, it's right between those two planets, in the edge between them. That's Chiron's astronomical area where he hangs out, And it's, of course, a crucial edge, because Saturn, with its rings, represents a really important boundary in the solar system, him being pretty much the furthermost outwards planet that we can easily see with the naked eye. And then Uranus was the first planet in the sequence to be discovered by a combination of maths and technology. And that's a very big dividing line in terms of our experience, because Saturn is still connectable with, not a word, but I think you know what I mean, connectable with using the senses. We can see it, we know it's there. And Uranus is like the edge of the invisible world where we can't see things with our own normal senses. That said, I have heard that some people can see Uranus, but certainly, averagely, we don't see it. It needs technology for us to see into that world. And so it is like a threshold, a doorway.
So because of that, Melanie, do you see Chiron as guiding us through that liminal process of
Yes,
transformation and the
very
process
much
we're
so.
literally in now with Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn, Uranus, the ruler of Aquarius, and we're in this transition into the age of Aquarius.
Yes.
So, and in so many ancient cultures, the healers, the wise ones, were the liminal ones.
Yeah.
So it seems like that's part of Chiron's challenge, but part of Chiron's gift.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like being the god of the in-between. And as I'm sure many people who might watch this will know the experience of feeling like you've fallen through the cracks when you're in transition, where the old has faded or disappeared sufficiently to not be there as a ballast or a sense of security, something that is known, where that's either faded or could even have been stripped out of our lives in a very dramatic way. And at the same time, the new that we can feel we're moving towards, or that people keep tell us that we're moving towards. We can't see it. We don't know what it is. And we endlessly make up what we think it is. And then go, faithfully down that path only to hit a brick wall or to lose the map. Or anyway, it doesn't work because we're busy just following our own confabulations and our own anxiety-based structures that we're imposing on it. But Uranus is more like a clear space into which can come all kinds of things that we maybe never thought of, And so Chiron is right in between there, in this space, which inevitably opens up around transition. Now, some transitions in life are ones that we all go through. We start out in the womb, and then we're born out into the daylight world, and then we grow up, go through all kinds of physical changes, hormonal changes, and so forth. And then we go to school for the first time, and eventually we come out the other end, where we leave school, we maybe go to college, we may get married, but there are many, many things which traditionally have been celebrated as transitions in our life, all the way through. And as we go along, it could be a first job, could be the birth of our own child. And as women, we go on being of childbearing age until our menopause. That's another big transition. And there is, let me say something here. So you've probably all heard of the male menopause, and different people write different stuff about that. So as an astrologer, I'm completely convinced that the male menopause is connected with the Chiron return, age 50. I think I can truly say that any male client I've ever spoken to who's either described what they're going through or has come out with the phrase, I think I'm in the male menopause, and it sucks, without fail, there's been something to do with the Chiron return there. So I offer that to you, and any of you who have a kind of researcher's mind, do get going with that, because it works,
Well, it's fascinating because that's often the time frame for women going through menopause.
Exactly. Thank you for adding that in. Yes,
So
of
it's such
course.
a, I see that in with the clients that I see is such a profound time for women also of
Mm,
that transition in their lives from often being in a role of caretaker
mm.
to increasing empowerment. And I do see that as such a powerful time where whatever is unresolved in those early Chiron wounds in our lives, it gets reactivated at
Yeah,
time to,
yeah, absolutely.
but to support us in moving into our healing gifts in a more full way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've even found that, women who, for whatever reason, have had to have a hysterectomy much, much earlier in their life for various health reasons, when they come to the Chiron return, it's as if they go through all the other levels of what the menopause can be about, which at one level may well connect them back with the trauma of losing their womb. But there can be all kinds of other connections. And so they kind of go together in many women's life. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes, so I was just saying about transition. So some of them are biological transitions. Some of them are transitions that are in sync with how things go in the society in which we live and which we were born to, and so forth. And then there are also spiritual transitions in the process of awakening. And that's very individual in terms of its timing and the content of the experience. Some people awaken to their own spiritual journey consciously, very young in their lives. And typically they will be misfits in one way or another. They might struggle with the educational system. They might just feel like the world of the adults is not making sense to me, and I don't really want to go there. And that, in terms of the period of puberty and as adolescence and all of that, the spiritual level of some of the erstwhile hormonal struggles that many young people go through can really be seen as the soul and the spirit's reaction against some of the craziness in the world out there, the so-called adult world and so on. They're basically saying, no, 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 no. We know there's a better way, okay? And that can be very heartbreaking. And yet, with even a little bit of understanding of even a notion of a spiritual journey, and that it's got its own timing, it doesn't follow clock time. That belongs to Saturn. But we have Chiron's timing, which we could call Kairos time.
Mm.
It's the timing of the soul. Sometimes that might get in sync with the clock and the seasons and so on, but not necessarily. It's got its own internal logic and so forth. And I think Chiron really does stand for that.
Oh, that is so beautiful, Melanie. And in light of that, it feels like it is such a guide to us now in this time of spiritual transformation that we're going through as we move into
Absolutely.
Aquarius and being able to move through the liminal time of letting go of the old paradigms, but not knowing what the new forms will look like yet. In
Yeah.
light of that, what do you make of the fact that Chiron was conjunct the North Node for so much of this year in Aries?
Yes. Well, Chiron reaches its aphelion in Aries. And that's the furthest point away from the sun. And so these last few years, in addition to the fact that, well, still now, the North Node is still in Aries, but additional to that, at the aphelion point, after that, the overall movement of Chiron's orbit shifted from going further and further out, further out, further out, further away from the center of our solar system, which is the sun. And of course, in the horoscope, the sun represents our core, our center, and is connected with the heart via the sign of Leo. And so the metaphor of going further and further away from the center, away, 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 way, way out in a limbo, or way out further away and going, out, out, out. So much mileage in that. It's almost like that going further out, and it's ruled by Mars, of course, this aphelion. We could say that's a symbol of the progressism that has bedeviled the last few hundred years, that dominates our society and our values and all the rest of it. And so to be turning direction is profound, because it's Chiron's journey back in towards the sun, where he will eventually even go through the orbit of Saturn and be closer than Saturn is to the sun. So Chiron pierces through the orbit of Saturn. And how I feel that is that it's like the opening up of the ring pass knot of Saturn. Saturn can also represent our ego defenses, the structures that have built up within the soul to enable us to cope and so forth. And they tend to hang around and crystallize in such a way that they become obstructions or things that oppress us, etc. So Chiron going through that orbit, it's almost like opening all that up. Now, one part of what happens with that is that it's a big ouch, because Chiron goes through our defenses, the things that we have been building up in order to protect us, and which on the spiritual journey, we're blessed to be put back in touch with those when we're ready. So it's not like storming the Bastille, because it opens up in its own time and in its own way. And I think that's part of the Chiron process, is to open up those Saturnian closed doors so we can make contact with what is below that. Give it the compassionate space to allow the energy to move and heal. There was a time, I think, when in the development of deeper and deeper understanding about different kinds of healing and psychological work and so forth, when it's almost like the notion was that you had to blast through your defenses and, cathart out whatever was behind it. But I think that's evolved now.
Absolutely. Because it often re-traumatized people.
Thank you for saying that, Heather. Yes. With your own background, have you got anything more you'd like to add to that Chiron perspective?
Well, it's just exquisite, your description, Melanie, in that you're really describing how in that going to the farthest in its orbit from the sun, Chiron is helping us to see individually and collectively where we get disconnected from source
Mm.
helps us come back and circle back into connection with source, but then pierces through those defenses of our ego to also help us go into that deeper inner journey to connect to our true essence and source, our soul self. So even though I think the Chiron process can feel wounding at times or
Mm.
help us be aware of our wounds or imbalances or patterns that we're needing to heal, it's bringing that exquisite healing energy to guide us how to bring those things into the light of consciousness
Yeah,
to be healed and restored.
yeah, absolutely. And so naturally, when we're in the thick of a process, all we want is for it to stop. It's like, when is this going to end, And often, if we can learn a deeper and deeper kind of acceptance and holding, it's that which allows the energy to move. And by the way, I have definitely come to feel that the energy of Chariklo, the wife of Chiron,
And say,
embodies something like that. And, when I was first learning about Chariklo, well, in fact, I'll say this briefly, but the very weekend that Chariklo was discovered, I was actually in South Africa doing a weekend workshop on Chiron. And I vividly remember coming back to the place where I was staying on the Saturday night, intending to just go over my notes for the next day and all that. And I kind of went into this completely spontaneously, went into this profound state of absolute bliss. One of those states where everything is perfect. Even though, of course, I could have been sitting there focusing on difficulties and dangers associated with being in South Africa at that time, 1997. But in this other state, the entireness of creation was utterly perfect. And I sort of dwelled in that for a really long time, feeling the presence of this being, don't know how else to say it, and I don't really have the words to convey it. But that workshop was towards the end of my trip. So the next week, I went back to England and got the news that another centaur had been discovered. And it turned out it was exactly on the night where I was sitting there in this particular state. So that became a kind of lodestone for me in terms of the core quality of what this being, not yet called Chariklo, was about. So then the following year she was named, and I went to start researching her, and there's nothing there. There's hardly anything in the usual classical sources about her. And so I then felt immediately, I thought, oh, this invisibleness and intangibleness has to somehow be central to what she's about. And the fact that she's absent from most of the classical sources, or tiny anecdotes that don't kind of add up or fit anywhere or whatever, that all has to be significant.
Mm.
And then I thought about Chiron and his long, long life of not being able to heal his own wound. I believe it's Apollodorus states that Chiron lived for 900 and something years with this unhealable wound, right? Before that was all transformed by his connection with Prometheus and that whole side of the story. But I had this flash and thought, so who was looking after Chiron when he was busy looking after everybody else while being mortally wounded and in terrible pain? And I thought it had to have been the wife about whom hardly anything is written, or that has survived, I don't know. And it all began to make sense. I thought, oh, so Chiron is bringing to us perhaps the yang side of the healing process, where you really have to do something about it. You have to change your diet, change the quantity of fluids that you need, take up a gym subscription, take medicines. You have to get active to put like positive Mars type of energy into your own project of getting well, okay? So that's the yang side of the healing. Or even you might have to go under the surgeon's knife, something, really Marsy. That's all part of the healing process. And then Chariklo represents the whole healing field within which all the above can optimally occur. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, and this is based on anecdotes I've both experienced and heard from clients, go as far to say that there are situations where the yang part of the healing process kind of doesn't really matter which yang part you choose, like which kind of alternative practitioner or which kind of a doctor, etc. But if they lack that sense of the Chariklo sense, it's not going to work. And I've seen that often.
It's so interesting, Melanie, because I really do, like you're saying, see Chariklo as that profound healing capacity to hold sacred space,
Absolutely.
to bear witness,
Absolutely.
to not do anything, but hold that capacity to allow the other to feel seen and heard and held. And in my own practice as a clinical psychologist, as I deepened in my work across the years, I became more and more aware of how profoundly healing that way of being in empathic attunement and
Absolutely.
healing relationship is at the heart of healing.
Yes. And so the phrase bearing witness comes to my mind. And through Chariklo, what I learned is also how valuable this bearing witness, and just as Heather described so beautifully, how valuable that can be for ancestral work. Because, often what happens with ancestral work is that people who begin exploring or feel called to learn about their ancestry and so on, it's common to come across a lot of information which can be deeply upsetting. And it doesn't have to be madly dramatic and acutely traumatic, but even just feeling into what your forebears went through based on a few facts, what I would call emotional imagination, very akin to empathy. And then some people react to that by going, oh my God, look at this. I've got to do something, but what can I do? Now, sometimes when one is doing ancestral work, something you really can do or even need to do, you'll be shown. Making a pilgrimage to a place that was significant for the ancestors, heard amazing stories about how that can change people's lives. Or even just settle something in your heart and soul. That your own private little pilgrimage that you did without being told to, but that's what you got to do. It settled something in your heart and soul, which is very precious because, we can connect Saturn, certainly, with our forebears, with the ancient past, with the ancestors, just as a kind of a fact or a legacy and so forth. But if we think about Chiron kind of opening those doors of Saturn, it's like the whole realm can come alive for people in a very powerful way. And in fact, there are people far wiser than myself who have very much stated that they feel that the opening of the barrier between the living and the dead and the capacity to traverse both of those sacred realms is part of the new world that is birthing itself at the moment. And I first came across the articulation of, I've always had a sense of that and had experiences with my own ancestry that absolutely illustrate that. But I hadn't really seen it written anywhere. People write about the afterlife or what happens after death and so forth, or even about dying and the immediate aftermath. But mostly in Western cultures, there's no easy notion of an exchange between the living and the dead, or that that's a valid field of relationality. And just want to mention at this point that the work of Dr. Daniel Foor, that's F-O-O-R, he's completely in sync with the notion that I've just mentioned. And I believe that he was born about a couple of weeks before Chiron was discovered. When I first heard him teach, I said to one of my friends, I said, oh my God, this is like the voice of Chiron speaking.
Well, and also, Melanie, it feels like in your writing and exploration of Pholus and Nisus, they so relate to that importance of ancestral healing, which we are becoming increasingly more aware of, the ways in which these generational patterns come down the family line and impact us often in ways that we're not even conscious of.
Yeah.
And that it feels like these other centaurs help support the, Pholus taking the lid off what's been hidden.
Yes.
And Nisus, the buck stops here. Your phrases about how do I finally work this ancestral pattern to heal it. And I really believe when we heal those ancestral patterns, we're healing back 7 generations and forward 7 generations.
Yeah.
But it's so profound that these centaurs are so supporting that process of ancestral healing.
That's what I feel. And I do feel that the connection with and some understanding of this in-between realm, which links the living and the dead, I do feel this is part of the new cosmology, which is developing all by itself, as it were, but it's part of where we're going. And what is so beautiful is that it's not so much that it's we who have to heal our ancestral issues. It's way deeper than that. It's more like what we can do is open that space and trust in the deep core of our being, which of course will be connected with both with our most ancient ancestors and also with the spiritual source to which we are also connected, almost like a heaven and earth scenario. So those major source energies, we can hand it over, so to speak, to them. It's not us who have to do it.
Beautiful.
And I say that because often, as I mentioned already, often people greet more knowledge about the ancestors with some alarm and a wish to fix it. I've got to fix it, heal it, make it better, etc. And sometimes the foundation of that occurs through this kind of bearing witness that Heather was describing so beautifully. And sometimes there are active things that we can do. And as I'm talking about that, I'm thinking of various things that I've done that have been specific and active and also very enriching in a way, you know.
But you're also saying that we're not alone in it, that we are guided by our
Totally.
spirit guides, but guided also by those ancestors
Totally.
who want to support the healing of those family lineage patterns. And when we open to it, they can work with us
Exactly.
and through us.
And also from my own experiences, I really began to sense how that connection between the living and the dead, whether we're aware of it or accept it or not, can be active in such a way that there's a shared field of transformation. So in other words, my own willingness to sit with my own process, and that includes struggling with it and wanting it to go away and all the rest of it. But when we're on the journey, you know, really, so that commitment to the soul life and the inner journey and so on, that itself acts in a resonant, losing words here, in a resonant field with the ancestors, well, with any ancestors who might be resonating in with themes of your journey, which of course is highly likely because themes run in families. And you can track that sometimes with the astrological signification, you know. So let's say that I was born with a complicated aspect between Jupiter and Saturn. So if I would search my own ancestry and their charts, I'm bound to find that's like a thread running through the ancestry as well. So that means that every work I do on that part of myself, in terms of balancing things out, in terms of insight, understanding, kindness, all these things, the ancestors who are on that same line, they get the benefit of that too. And and then when I did some study with Dr. Daniel Four, I was over the moon. He's not an astrologer, so doesn't use that kind of a language. But the process he was describing was exactly that. And I was completely over the moon to hear it articulated like that, is that there's a shared or familial field within which, however we contribute to what we think is our own healing, is also of benefit to the ancestors. And if that idea touches you, you can even specifically make a dedication for that, you know? And that this is part of the new cosmology. And, you know, of course, we might discover actually there's nothing hardly new about it at all. There are still plenty of cultures on this planet who understand that.
Well, if anything, we may be the aberration, we Westerners who
I
feel,
was just about to say that.
because, you know, and even I remember a friend who was a hospice worker would tell me that they had done research where 80% of family members of someone who had died would experience either seeing them or communicating with them after death, but they wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Because in Western culture, we don't believe in that. And then
Yes.
I would interact with, I was friends with this Brazilian healer for a while, and she said, oh, it's a part of our culture that
Yeah.
you have a chair at the table for
Yes.
your relatives who've died and you communicate with them. And she said we would see them and talk with them and
Yeah.
resolve what was unresolved in our relationships with them. So it is that deep ancient awareness that
Mm-hmm.
we are connected to the spirit realm, that and I do believe the veils between the worlds are more and more thinning and opening us back to that awareness that
Yeah.
we're connected with all of that.
And, even to have in the collective, as it were, uh, ideas about cosmology that can easily include the kind of experiences we're talking about. This is kind of building on something you just said. But oftentimes, people are having all kinds of interdimensional experiences, and they don't have an easy conversational vernacular to talk about it. And because there's such a dampening down and a lack of permission to talk about it, it gets hidden away. And often all it takes is for that person to be in the presence of somebody who has a natural capacity to embrace those kind of experiences, for them to feel that it's safe to open up. And they do. Even with something as simple as the cycle of the moon. Now, I mean, compared to some of the things we're referring to here, cycle of the moon kind of sounds a bit banal, right? It's kind of very ordinary. But when we get into the feeling of connection with the energy of the moon and its cycles, I've had so many clients, typically the kind of client who maybe it's the first time for any kind of reading and maybe they're a little self-conscious or a little nervous. And then I start rabbiting away about the moon cycle because it's significant in their transits and so forth. And you can almost see them looking to one side. It's like, I guess it's safe to talk about this because there's nobody else in the room, right? Or even they'll ask me to turn off the tape recorder, which I do, of course. And then they will say that they've been having experiences of energy type connections with the moon for their whole life, but nobody else was talking about it. And so she thought it was something she wasn't supposed to speak about, etc., etc. And then the liberation of knowing that, hey, this is kind of normal and something you can welcome and be supported by in your life, And so this is a similar thing.
In terms of that, Melanie, can I just ask you a
Yes,
question
please.
about that? Because it's interesting to me that Chiron, Nisus, and Pholus all cross planetary orbits. So, like you're just describing, they're helping us move between the worlds and make these connections and
Yes.
understand these things like you're describing. But I find it interesting that Chariklo, whose orbit is between Saturn and Uranus, the others are all elliptical and they
Mm-hmm.
cross other planetary orbits, but she doesn't. And
Yeah.
she's very symmetrical. Do you think
Yeah.
that's symbolic of the way she just holds space?
Yes, I believe she's also the largest one of all the centaurs. Oh, and has the most stable of all the orbits. I believe Chiron has the most unstable
Interesting.
of the orbits. So he was kind of holding a lot of unstable, chaotic kind of energy kind of thing, but did it beautifully, of course, because he's Chiron. but a big contrast there. And I love the idea of her nestling right there in the hot zone between the impossible opposites of Saturn and Uranus, without, as it were, interfering with anybody else's orbit. Just kind of sits there and lets the opposites kind of do their thing, break each other up or riot or, whatever, what happens when two such opposites are confronting each other. And she just kind of sits there in the middle. Well, in the sacred space that is where the opposites meet.
And also, it feels to me like she, in a way, is just holding sacred space and that stability for the other healing centaurs to be on their journeys and in their more active exploration and healing process. And she
Yes.
holds that foundation of staying centered and bearing witness and being the empathic one, holding that
Yeah.
loving, healing energy for the others.
Yeah, that's very close to how I see it. And one thing I love about the centaurs and exploring them seems to me that the raw facts of the astronomy are absolutely bursting with meaning. The actual, even the literal cosmos of our solar system feels like it's literally speaking to us. That's how I feel it anyway.
That's
These marvelous
beautiful.
details, like Chariclo being the biggest and the most stable one.
And the most symmetrical.
Yes.
And it just feels so synchronistic that they've come into our awareness in this critical time where we are needing to do our own healing process.
Yeah.
Be bringing into the light of consciousness what we need to clear, what we need to heal in order to move through this incredible evolutionary leap as humanity.
Yeah.
Into the Aquarian age, into a higher consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. And something else about the way that Chiron goes through the orbit of Saturn, and then goes round and then through them. It's almost like that represents the cyclicity of how our process will go. And if we should be, I'm going to say bold enough to say, oh, okay, finished, done with that. Now I understand that. And now it's all gone, and so on. Okay, like sometimes that is really so. But I'd venture to say more often, that's not quite how it works. There's a cyclicity, a spirality. And if our own soul journey needs us to understand more about something in the past, we will be taken back there and back there and back there till we really get it. And it's not just one thing. It's that doing so, I'm making movements like I'm sewing something together here. And I think that's kind of relevant, There's a mending that's also going on. And it takes as long as it takes. Because, in the realms that we're referring to, we could say, well, they're timeless. Time in the realms we're referring to, it's not the same as clock time. So even the notion of past lives, I think we have to be careful how we use that phrase and what we think we mean. Because I don't think you can just plonk that notion on top of other ways that we look at time and say, well, it's like that. And, once upon a time in the 16th century, I was here or there and did this or that. That might be too true. But to look at it in too much of a linear way, I think really limits what's really being referred to there. Looking at it thematically or from the point of view of planetary energies, to me, makes far more sense than getting fixated on the timing,
That makes so much sense. And I think even with what you're saying, that might be a good place to stop for today, but we have so much more to talk about. But it
Yes,
feels like part of what you're saying is that Chiron takes us out of time and takes us out of that linear perspective, whether it's about our ancestral history or our incarnational history or this life's history, to
yeah,
be in the present moment, to heal
yeah,
what needs to heal, to be in that opening to what needs to unfold.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you, Melanie, for
Thank
being
you,
in this
Heather.
conversation and for the way in which you embody these healing centaurs and their energy. And thank you.
Well, I think you do as well, at least as I see it. And I could converse with you for hours.
Well, to be continued.
To be continued. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your wisdom and thank you to all of you in the community.
Indeed.
Blessings to you.
Thanks for watching. Thanks, everybody.